Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Sheena Chestnut Greitens, Editor-in-Chief of TNSR, and I'm here with Dr. Ryan Vest, our Executive Editor. I'm pleased to have joining us today Michael Horowitz, author of the article Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Strategic Stability, which appears in the recently published special issue of the Texas National Security Review. Mike Horowitz is director of Perry Worldhouse and Richard Perry Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also a senior fellow for technology and innovation at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2022 to 2024, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities and Director of the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office at the Pentagon. Mike, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Super excited.
Mike, I love this article, and in it you frame the article around what you call the intersection of time, uncertainty, and confidence in capabilities, arguing that the two competing perspectives about AI and strategic stability may both be correct at different points in the technology's life cycle. What are these two perspectives, and why does this framework sit at the core of your argument?
Sure. I think that when we talk about the way that emerging technologies will influence international politics, we're often prone to making sort of universalist kinds of arguments like AI will be a disaster for the international security environment, or, quantum, that means like no more cybersecurity ever. When the reality is that it can depend on like all the same factors that influence military power in other contexts, which is shaped by essentially the relative balance of power, like what does one side have versus the other side have, and frankly, like how mature is the technology. And in thinking about artificial intelligence and strategic stability, you've seen a couple of different perspectives laid out. The first, which is, I think, by far the minority sort of viewpoint, is that you could imagine a world where AI enhances strategic stability. If you think about like what are algorithms good at doing, and that is, processing information faster than people, then things that algorithms might be really good at could include something like early warning surrounding a potential nuclear attack. And given that we imagine, for example, that decision makers make better choices when they have more time, to the extent that AI buys decision makers more time, maybe there's an argument for why it would enhance strategic stability. More people, I think, have made the opposite argument, which is that advances in artificial intelligence would actually be really bad for strategic stability. They point to the sort of error proneness of algorithms, like anyone that's ever had, ChatGPT throw an incorrect answer like back at them, or like tell them something that like definitively wasn't true, that you might have overconfidence in algorithmic accuracy, or what's called automation bias. You could frankly have the opposite, algorithm aversion, where people don't trust algorithms as much as they should. You have a range essentially of different kinds of biases that could lead to the integration of artificial intelligence in dangerous ways that then cause lots of problems for the international security environment. Where time, I think, factors in here is that over time of like, what do? We tend to figure out how technology works and figure out how to use it effectively and in ways that are safer and more responsibly. Whereas like really early on, when people don't know what they're doing and where expertise is much lower, like things like responsible use with emerging technologies becomes a lot more difficult. So it's easy for me to imagine, for example, that the introduction of AI into something like nuclear command and control, not saying it's a good idea, it could be destabilizing maybe early on in a period, but then as everybody kind of understands how to use it and is better calibrated in what algorithms can do and not do, then maybe it becomes more stabilizing. The point being, it's not just like a linear story.
So that's actually one of the things I found really fascinating in reading this article, is this idea that psychology and organizational behavior are really going to shape how AI conditions nuclear risk, and that those aren't going to be linear or flat over time, right? The effect of those factors. So I want to come back to that in a minute, but maybe before I do, you also walk readers through the history of artificial intelligence in this article in a really accessible way. And I found that really helpful. So I wondered if for the students and for listeners who are trying to get a handle on what AI is and all the ways it might affect debates in national security, how you see persistent misconceptions about AI making it difficult to have a conversation about the nuclear implications, and maybe are there lessons from earlier periods of AI's development that we should be looking at instead to frame the discussion about it today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's fascinating is artificial intelligence is in some ways like the thing that we can never actually achieve. And we see this over and over again over like a 60 to 70, some odd year period. And that if you think about AI at the core, is computers being able to do things that used to require human intelligence. At first people said, oh, if a computer could win at checkers, that'd be like a really smart computer. That would be artificial intelligence. Then it turns out that like that's actually not that hard to do once you have computers and you can program a little bit. People are like, all right. That was too easy. That's not artificial intelligence. If a computer could win at chess, like that would be like a really smart computer. That would be artificial intelligence. And then it turns out that's like really hard math, but that's a solvable problem. And then like, all right, well, that's not really intelligence. That's just like solving an equation. It's like, oh, if a algorithm could win at Go, like that would be artificial intelligence. And then of course, you have now like a decade ago, essentially this like AlphaGo moment where an algorithm beats one of the world's leading Go players. And then people say, all right, well, but Go's like mostly equations. It's not like that hard. And so, in some ways you can imagine this if you're a sports fan, like the goalposts are always moving on what constitutes artificial intelligence. And what's happened especially is as the frontier of artificial intelligence advances and people start talking about things like artificial general intelligence or artificial super intelligence or like all of those like kinds of things, but the article doesn't actually like get into like that much. One of the things that we forget is that there are all these things that we like don't even call AI anymore that involve like even old school algorithms or machine learning, like those kinds of things that actually have been now embedded into military systems for decades and that are already sort of shaping how militaries behave and think about how to use this technology from a national security perspective, which like on the one hand, frankly, should be reassuring. This is like not the first rodeo for, like big national militaries like the United States in like thinking about algorithms. Like on the other hand, to the extent that you think about artificial intelligence as a general purpose technology the way that I do, and it's impacting everything, and we're in a world where like a decade from now you could have AI embedded in every military system, frankly, like nuclear and non-nuclear. The question is like where and how and for what use cases, and like that I think is the question that is often missing from the conversation. What kind of algorithm makes sense probably depends sometimes on what are you using it for. I mean, how high leverage is that use case? Like the regular, like a Chat GPT or something, or like a Claude trained on like all of the data from the internet is not going to help you identify whether, the Russians have launched a missile faster. That's more of like a bespoke data question, like for example. And so like what data, what algorithm, what use case, like that all really matters a lot in trying to unpack this question.
So I want to jump in on that a little bit because in the article, a recurring concern that you come up with is that many AI systems, especially those in the nuclear domain, need to be trained on simulated data, given that there are no real world examples.
Which is good, just to be clear.
Right.
I'm anti-nuclear war.
Yeah, we don't want that. But with stakes that high, when you talk about nuclear war, how should policymakers think about deploying systems that we can never thoroughly or fully train through experience?
I mean, that's true. Also, it's inevitable and it applies to humans today. If you think about like, if the question is, could we use an algorithm to detect a missile launch and we need to use simulated data to train the algorithm? If the alternative is like a human who's sitting there like bleeding out of their eyeballs because they're like standing there like looking to see if there's a missile launch, like what data are we using to train them? It's that same simulated data. So I think that there's a real question about the extent to which simulated data can mimic reality. And there are a whole bunch of debates out there in the AI world on that context. If what we are talking about in like an early warning, I've like made it as easy as possible for me now. And so in answering this question, but if what we are talking about is a missile launch, that's actually like a relatively discrete like kind of thing to be able to like train an algorithm to look at. And so I feel like relatively more confident in that, but there's still risk. But this also gets to a question that I don't think we ask enough when it comes to the integration of AI into military systems, which is what was doing the job before and how good was it? And that, like, to me, this is all relative. Like, if you tell me that there's like an AI early warning system that's going to be like super error prone, then obviously I'm not going to be excited about it. But if you tell me it's super error prone, but like actually the humans that were doing it before were more error prone, that now raises like broader questions about like systems and processes that maybe we should also be solving. This is also why I think the notion of human machine teaming when it comes to AI in the nuclear context seems like really important in that the integration of AI into intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance for conventional operations by militaries, like that's inevitable, like that's happening. There are timing and implementation questions, but that's a thing. And to the extent that nuclear command and control relies in part on some of the same sensors that, say, a military like the United States or China or somebody else, would use in the context of a conventional conflict, that means even if you're trying to exclude AI from, some bespoke nuclear systems, you still are going to have a degree of integration in existing systems, which is why, to me, what we're really talking about is sort of human machine teaming, human machine integration. What we want is accuracy. Then what we want is the best of what machines can do with the best of what people can do. And that requires like new kinds of then training and developing standard operating procedures. But like that's a thing militaries can do.
I think this is a really important point, right? We have to be really careful not to assume a fallible AI and an infallible human, because we just know that's not the
I don't know if you
way
know
the
this, Sheena, but
world
people are
works.
not good at stuff sometimes.
Really? I didn't know. No. So this question about human machine interface and human machine teaming makes me want to ask about a couple of questions or biases that your article talks about that could come up at that interface, right? And so one of the things you walk us through in the article is this idea that AI enabled early warning systems could either reduce or increase nuclear risks, and that one of the things that could shape the level of risk is automation bias. So can you just tell our listeners, first, what is automation bias? How does it change the role of human judgment in crisis decision making? And then how does this shape the broader context of nuclear command and control?
Yeah, absolutely. So automation bias is when people trust algorithms more than they should based on the like known accuracy of the algorithm. So imagine an algorithm that is 80% accurate at whatever the task could be, whether it's like determining whether something is a cat or determining whether something is a missile launch or like whatever it is. If it's 80% accurate, that means it's wrong 20% of the time. But if you take that 80% accuracy and people treat it as 85%, 90%, 95% accurate, that's what automation bias is. When you trust algorithms more than you should based on the accuracy of those algorithms. What it leads to is what's called cognitive offloading, when people essentially take the keys out of the car and like hand over control over to the algorithm. And we've seen accidents happen for this reason before, like out there in the regular world. We see in varieties of airplane crashes where autopilot has been at issue. Like one of the reasons why you sometimes have these issues is that pilots are like, well, but the autopilot says that we're fine. Like, how could there be a problem? When really there are all sorts of other indicators that suggest that something is wrong, but they have learned to trust the autopilot and or trust the autopilot too much based on how accurate it is. We're not like condemned to fail because of the risk of automation bias. What it suggests in some ways is that education and training and procedure is necessary to hedge against it. In some ways, and that becomes more necessary as algorithms improve more. Because if you have algorithms that are like a coin flip, then that kind of raises the question about like why you're using them in the first place. But imagine you're using your coin flip algorithm. It's going to be pretty clear that it's a coin flip algorithm, and so the degree to which you rely on that when making decisions is going to be pretty limited. But if you have algorithms that maybe 9 out of 10 times are right, then the instinct to trust that algorithm can obviously grow, which then makes it a lot more difficult in some ways to like challenge that judgment when it comes to decision making. What can really influence this, and I published a paper with a great co-author named Lauren Kahn about 2 years ago in, a different journal, about automation bias that showed essentially a version of the Dunning-Kruger effect in play, where at basically no knowledge about AI, people were kind of algorithm averse. They're like, I don't want anything to do with that algorithm. Like that seems like kind of like wacky and dangerous. At low levels of knowledge, that's when automation bias became most likely. People became overconfident, essentially. Like a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous, like that kind of story. And then at higher levels of knowledge, then people started to get better calibrated. And better calibration is when you reduce the risk of automation bias. And that's frankly what we're going to want, to the extent that you have AI integration in the nuclear enterprise at the sort of early warning kind of stage, which I just said in the answer to the previous question kind of is inevitable because of conventional sensors. Then we need to get to that point of calibration, which means now there's like work to be done. on AI literacy, on AI training, on, like doctrine, et cetera.
So this is kind of interesting. The theme I'm starting to pull out of this is that the interface between humans and AI is maybe the most important thing that we need to start focusing on in how we integrate, how we interact with these artificial intelligence machines and algorithms. But that brings up a question. One of the most common things that I see as people discuss AI is they talk about it accelerating things like warfare or decisions to machine speed. How does this increased speed interact with human cognition and stress? And what kind of risks do we need to worry about, especially when we're talking about nuclear crisis?
I'm sure I wrote something like that. I mean, I published an article on AI and the balance of power for the Texas National Security Review back in 2018, which was, I think, one of the earlier articles probably like on these topics in general. And thank you very much. And the one of the things you see here is the issue is if you could have algorithmic driven decision making going like faster than humans, which is one of the advantages, then there are clearly some downsides as well. The question in some ways is whether what we are talking about is tactical or operational. And that at the tactical level, say, if you imagine something like collaborative combat aircraft, but that are, like fully autonomous, then they're still doing missions that, humans go tell them to do, and they can do them faster and more effectively. And so you're fighting at machine speed, but you're still like under the supervision of a human. Where I think people get really worried is at the operational level. Say if you had the combatant commander for US forces in the Indo-Pacific sort of delegating control of like a big conflict against a really large country to an algorithm and like letting the algorithm like designate, all right, like which targets, like which shooters, which sensors, like that's, I think, the thing that people worry about sometimes is when the algorithm shifts from being a teammate and a helper to being to sort of replacing judgment and speeding up conflict. Because the question then is, it's like if an accident happens, if something bad happens, like how does that influence then the prospect for escalation? And to me, the some of the biggest risks here surround countries that view themselves as having unstable second strike capabilities. I think the basic idea is that the more robust, the more secure your second strike capabilities are, the less likely you are as a military to over rely on AI and delegate essentially decision making within nuclear command and control to artificial intelligence. You might still be at higher risk of accidents for like all the reasons that we've been talking about, like automation bias, like those kinds of things. But fundamentally, if you believe in deterrence and you believe in second strike capabilities, then it doesn't matter how fast somebody is coming at you, you will always have the ability to retaliate. So even if somebody's coming at you at machine speed and somehow like destroys some of your military, you still have second strike capabilities that are robust and able to respond, which in theory means then that nuclear deterrence should hold. The problem is if you are a country with nuclear weapons that doesn't have stable second strike capabilities, the incentives may change. Now imagine you are facing an adversary, even a conventionally armed adversary, fighting at machine speed that you worry now has the ability to decapitate you and decapitate you before, say, you could give a launch order or do something to try to like place your nuclear forces on alert. The risk is that creates incentives then for nuclear powers that don't have stable second strike capabilities to engage in all of the worst and most dangerous like launch posture and doctrine decisions from the Cold War. Things like launch on warning, pre-delegation, all of that, like good stuff, essentially because they're seeking to avoid being decapitated at machine speed. And so this is another way of saying so much of the writing on this topic is basically about like what could happen to the US nuclear enterprise in a world of AI integration. Don't worry about the US in this context. She's been very clear that the US wants nothing to do with AI integration into the like deep elements of nuclear command and control. Worry about North Korea. Worry about, countries that we think have a lot less stable second strike capabilities, because those are the ones that are going to be at much higher risk in an era of AI from machine speed war, increasing the risk of escalation.
So I was just actually about to ask you if we could put some proper nouns in the conversation and start talking about some countries. How does this explain what we're seeing across the nuclear powers, either established Russia, China, the United States, with large nuclear arsenals and what we think is secure second strike capability, versus some of the newer nuclear powers. How does this variation in perceptions of secure second strike capability help us understand what we're seeing about how these different countries are responding to AI in their nuclear enterprises?
So there are a couple of trends I think we've seen in how countries are thinking about AI and nuclear weapons, and with like caveat, no idea what North Korea actually thinks. Sheena, you would know better than anybody. Like, tough to get data on these kinds of on this kind of topic.
Especially that question.
Like, right, like in particular. And so what we have seen is that I think it's interesting that every country that has looked at this question and published something on it, and that's the US, the UK, France, and China, has basically said, we don't want anything to do with AI enabled decision making over nuclear weapons. So we saw this first in the US in the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review. Shout out to our friend Vipin. And we saw this in a sort of trilat NPT statement by the US, UK, and France. And then in the Biden-Xi agreement in like November 2024, I think, everybody who's like really looked at this closely has said human control over nuclear weapons, that's the way we want to go. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that countries might not then integrate AI into, still believe that they would have control in a pre-delegation situation or a launch on warning situation. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's not human control. Russia's sort of the wild card in this context. Russia has been the fragments of info we seem to have on Russia suggest that they are similarly skeptical about the value, essentially, of delegating nuclear launch decisions to machines. On the other hand, there's two pieces of contrary information for Russia. One is, of course, their historical dead hand perimeter system, which was not an AI system, but essentially like a set of like levers and pulleys, basically, whatever, like a radio-based system, like from the Cold War, designed to enable a Soviet nuclear launch, even in a decapitation situation, which like fits the logic in some ways of what I'm talking about. So like that's piece one. They've already shown interest in this. Piece two is if you look at what they've done with the Poseidon system, this uncrewed underwater vehicle that Russia is developing, and there's some public sources suggesting has like at least tested, that would be nuclear armed, where the idea is you could take essentially a uncrewed nuclear armed submarine and put it like off the coast of the United States, say, like just in case you ever needed it. And like, I got a lot of like operational questions about how that's going to work, to be honest. But the Russians have clearly shown a little more interest in some ways in delegating. This makes sense in some ways, depending on how you think about the role of regime type here. Like, Sheena, you've heard me talk before that when I worry about like bad decisions when it comes to AI and military systems in general, but especially nuclear weapons, I worry about autocracies a lot more than I worry about democracies. And the reason is that autocratic countries do not trust their people to begin with. If they did, they would have different kinds of governments. I mean, look at Xi's consolidation over China's military. If you're an autocratic country, anything you can do to cut pesky, unreliable people out of the like chain of command and chain of decision, there's arguably an upside to. And so to the extent that AI offers the temptation or the reality of letting you skinny down the number of people that you need to rely on prior to making decisions, whether those decisions are like using military force against your population, like, or launching nuclear weapons. I think that there are some autocratic, not that there aren't risks for democracies, but I think that there are some autocratic risks here. And like, there's an autocratic logic of centralization in an era of AI that I worry about a little bit in the nuclear weapons context here, independent of the like second strike argument I was making.
Yeah, well, thanks for getting to the autocracy authoritarian regime question, because you knew I was going to go there at some point. And
I mean, how could we not talk about it, given that like you are the one interviewing me?
Well, I'm glad you covered it, because I was gonna get there anyway. Let me then ask a sort of maybe a little bit of a cynical question, which is, several states, as you mentioned, autocracies and democracies have emphasized keeping humans in the loop, right? You think about the Biden-Xi agreement, and the other countries, I think you said Britain and France as well, have emphasized keeping humans in the loop for nuclear decision making. How meaningful do you think those commitments are? I mean, that readout, the Biden-Xi readout, was like a couple of sentences, right? And so is that a credible political assurance, or is this kind of temporary and tactical because it's really hard to verify any use of AI in nuclear command and control? I mean, a lot of arms control before depended on some verification of AI in nuclear command and control. Those two things put together seem incredibly hard to come up with any sort of verification regime. So, are these sort of going to be durable norms? Are they tactical? Are they political commitments that could change with leaders or regime change? Like, how do we think about the current landscape of the idea or the commitment, the norm of keeping humans in the loop?
Arms control? I feel like back in the recesses of my brain, there was like a thing called arms control. But since we're recording this right after the end of New Start, and I think that this question surrounding arms control and verification when it comes to the nuclear AI nexus is kind of tricky. I think first thing I would say is I have been skeptical for years that binding arms control, that verifiable arms control is possible in this arena for the most part, simply for exactly the reason you said, Sheena, which is that for most countries, the countries aren't going to let you like plug into their nuclear systems and check their software to see exactly how autonomous it is. Think about how hard it was to get people to even get to counting missiles during the Cold War or immediately after the Cold War. And so I think that's a really heavy lift to ask states to do. So I am not that optimistic about the possibility of verification in this. And so if what you need is verification to feel confident, then I think unfortunately states are unlikely to get it. I think the question is the chain of logic that would lead a country to AI enabled decision making surrounding nuclear use. And here, actually, I think that this is a place where the incentives of leaders might cut in a way that could make one less worried about the impact on stability. And here's why. We just talked about the sort of autocratic logic of control over AI and some of the risks that arguably generates if you skinny down the number of people that you have to rely on. But what do leaders like more than anything else? They like control. That's frankly true, whether it's like democratic leaders or autocratic leaders. And so Dan Reiter in his new book, Untying Hands or Untied Hands, argues that in some ways it's like launching a broadside against the spiral model of war, which I'm actually 100% here for. But as part of that, he argues that leaders actually have a lot more control over escalation dynamics than a lot of IR theory tends to assume, because they wish to have the final say and so always keep off ramps for themselves. And if one believes that, and since he was my undergraduate advisor, I feel compelled to say that it's obviously correct. He was my undergraduate advisor. I do actually think that there's real logic there. And there's an incentive away from the most dangerous kind of decision making, which would be kind of outsourcing like decision making to an AI surrounding nuclear use. Because if it was credible, if it's not a team, if you're just delegating like you've thrown out the steering wheel, now the leader's giving up control. And everything we know about how leaders make decisions in crises suggests that they want control. And in part, they want control because they want off ramps, because nobody wants to end up in a fight if they didn't wish to have it. And so you have kind of like that logic, which should suggest the desire for control, in some ways like countervailed by some of what I was saying before, which is you are a country with less stable second strike capabilities in a war against machine speed, and the incentives that creates essentially for like relatively dangerous decision making. Up to this point, it seems like that logic of control has been more predominant in how countries are thinking about making decisions, which is why we've seen some of the announcements that we have seen surrounding AI and nuclear weapons. But it's going to be really hard to verify in general, and it's going to be especially hard to verify as this era of AI continues and all military systems have some AI integrated in them in one way or another. frankly, and it's probably not going to be frontier AI all the time. The question that will then become, is there like some sort of like systemic or like aggregate risk in like a Scott Sagan-y kind of way that maybe is like tough to like measure or like operationalize? Where maybe like if you want to know like, hey, like why might I be wrong in how I think about this, or how like the logic in this paper would be wrong, an argument against the logic of this paper for why you should be more worried would be if you think that there are going to be all these little integrations of AI, they're going to be relatively hard to track. They're all going to be like pretty good, not perfect. And that increases sort of the interaction between those, like increases risk in some ways that we can like, that's hard to articulate, frankly, like let alone measure. Like I would say that like, that's not a, if you can't articulate what the risk is, like, or what are we really even talking about? That's an argument one could, I think, certainly make.
We seem to live in a sea of pessimism around AI and the future of AI, especially in nuclear arms control. But I'm really impressed that as we've talked today, you have this very optimistic tones, very optimistic look at the future. But with that in mind, because I think you've got a unique perspective here, and reading through the article, I really loved a lot of the things you had to say. What do policymakers need to take away from this? What do they need to be thinking about on how we should implement AI, and what we should be concerned about with our enemies implementing AI in the future?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, I tend to be a little more sanguine on escalation risk, I think in some cases than others. I think it's in part because of a project I worked on about a decade ago on geopolitical forecasting and quantifying geopolitical risk, which made me think that there can be sort of like escalation risk inflation that happens out there. And so when I hear lots of people saying like, OMG, the escalation risk, it like sometimes makes me like, is there? Is it? How bad is it? A thing that one could worry about, like honestly, is suppose you believe that the argument that I make in the paper and that I made here about second strike capabilities and AI integration risk, and basically like bad decision making surrounding AI. There's a story that one could tell that frankly only the United States has reliable second strike capabilities. We could say like, sure, like North Korea doesn't. Like, sure, Mike, that's an easy case for your argument. But like Russia and China have worried for decades about the possibility of American-driven decapitation, especially with advancing American nuclear capabilities. China's nuclear buildup is multifaceted. Like empirically it's multifaceted, but the logic behind it is also multifaceted. But frankly, the desire to increase the reliability of their nuclear capabilities in a world where the U.S. could launch a first strike is, I think, something that's certainly like seems like it's been on their minds. And so in that way, if you imagine a world where everybody believes that they don't have secure second strike capabilities relative to somebody else, all the way up to the United States, then there frankly could be a logic if AI enabled conventional capabilities get strong enough and accurate enough that essentially everybody but the United States then might feel maybe France and the UK, depending on how like allies and partners things are working, then might have an incentive then to engage in some of that pre-delegation or launch on warning or sort of riskier decision making because they fear machine speed decapitation. But this gets back to something that we talked about before, which is that this is all a play on psychology in some ways at the end of the day. Like we're talking about artificial intelligence, but what are the factors that to me at least are most salient in thinking about escalation risk? It's not the technology in and of itself, because militaries have testing and evaluation processes and validation and verification processes and all sorts of things designed to ensure that when systems are fielded, they actually do the things that they're supposed to do and don't do the things that they're not supposed to do. So like, let's presume it at like a basic level that these systems work, because frankly, if they don't, then those systems won't get fielded. The issue is that it's how humans interact with them, like what training and education looks like, and how policymakers think about escalation risk. For example, it is easy to imagine senior decision makers in the US government or any government either being frankly algorithm averse because they got to the positions they got to because of their expertise, not by relying on a computer, and so disregarding advice from an algorithm when they should accept it, or becoming infatuated with whiz-bang technology and falling prey to automation bias. The reality will probably depend on the situation and the person, which is not like comforting from a broad international relations theory perspective, but I think reflects the messiness of the way that policymaking would work. And that's especially true if what we are talking about is a low probability, high impact event, like the use of a nuclear weapon, which is not like a regular Tuesday for anybody, essentially. That's exactly when, in some ways, you would imagine people to like gut check to like how they think, and how that then interacts with these AI systems is tough to systematically anticipate.
So I think this is one of the really interesting things about the collection of essays that your article appears in, because some of them probe the sources of excessive techno optimism, and then others point out, as your essay does, that things like, military conservatism, to these testing regimes you just mentioned, bureaucratic caution and operating procedures could kind of constrain the adoption of really risky applications of AI. But I'm still struck by this point that confidence is not linear over time. And I'm wondering, just as kind of maybe a final question. You sit at Perry Worldhouse at UPenn. You're working with thinking about students and policymakers that are going into or advancing through careers in national security. Right? And you talk about in the article the idea that at different points in the cycle, there's this trust gap is bigger or smaller and can actually go in a different direction. So you can have underconfidence or overconfidence in AI depending on where you are in that time curve. So is there a way for universities or people who train policymakers in a whole bunch of contexts, or just people who might be called on to use AI and want to figure out how to do it better rather than worse, how should they think about, is there something they can do or that we can do as a national security enterprise to better calibrate people's assessments of what AI can and can't do and how accurate it is to use it well?
That's a great question. There are a bunch of different levels of this. I think, like, to me, this is an argument for AI literacy for everybody. This is not everybody needs to be a coder. It's not, everybody needs to be able to train the next generation of frontier models, but everybody being familiar with how AI works and how various AI systems work. And there are a growing number of training and education programs, frankly, that are designed to do just that. So, like, I mean, that I think is the like bumper sticker kind of takeaway on that. Like, one thing that's encouraging in this context is if you look at what the US military service academies are doing, they've all introduced in different ways, which is fine, frankly. Like, we're early in the era of this, and like this should be like a let a thousand flowers bloom world in some ways for training and education on responsible AI, or on using AI responsibly is probably the better way to say that than like the responsible AI bumper sticker. But if you look at the Naval Academy or the West Point or look at the Air Force Academy, they all have introduced AI curricular elements, both within where you would expect them in the classroom, like computer science and engineering, but also in how they're like teaching about the future of war, how they're like teaching cadets to like think in the context of leading on the battlefield, whichever domain that battlefield might be in. And to the extent that we think that more knowledge in this space from the experimental data, that more knowledge in this space tends to be better, because more knowledge tends to lead to more understanding of the limits of algorithms and thus like relatively better calibration, then like that kind of training is a great first step. And that in some ways, then we end up almost in a transition period where you have in some ways like your junior officers and probably even junior policymakers that are increasingly going to be like AI natives, and frankly understanding this because like they like come up like using AI systems in high school and like understand that like how fake a bunch of the things that they can get out of it could be. Like they might be like way better socialized on that than maybe like us. And then the question becomes, especially for the next like decade or so, as you have senior decision makers coming into positions of authority that maybe don't have that kind of background, how is it that you do training with them to get them up to speed? Because they're the ones in some ways that shoulder the biggest cognitive load in making decisions in general. And so their decisions about when and how to use AI will sort of like have the highest like leverage. But like to me, in some ways, this is like all about humility, about like our own knowledge and about what the systems can do. But to wrap with something on a slightly different axis, all of that is true. I do not think that is an excuse to go slow. I think that when we look at military innovation adoption in the United States, both like broadly, but that's certainly in this era, there's way more going too slowly rather than too quickly. And people are quick to point to experiments or prototypes or like random things from DARPA as evidence of some terrible thing that might happen, when in reality, that's the system working. And frankly, for the uses of AI that are proven to be effective, whether in the nuclear realm or not, the Pentagon has been slow to scale. And it's frankly time to hit the accelerator on some of those things.
That's a really good point, too, that there's a risk not just to adopting AI, but also not adopting it or being too slow to adopt it in a world where other actors are. This has been a really interesting discussion. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. Our guest today has been Michael Horowitz, author of the article Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Strategic Stability, which as always can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org, with the rest of the special issue in which his article appears. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen, and you can find all of our work at tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas System. This is Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Ryan Best. Thanks again for listening.